Welcome back to the Royal Palace Podcast, the podcast that explains French law and politics to Americans. I'm Liam, and this is Patrick.
Hey, everybody.
You may have noticed that it's been over a month since we last released an episode. Unfortunately, our inborn American industriousness has been corrupted by the slothful French tradition of taking the entire month of August off. And that's exactly the topic of our episode today: summer vacations in France.
I've ordered every federal agency to eliminate rules that don't make sense.
It's the usual French talk of stall and surrender.
All scientists, diners, entrepreneurs, the cultural form of America.
You Americans have given a lot of trouble. The sense was very evil.
Our planet great again.
Americans have an incredible amount of negative stereotypes about the French. They're smelly, they're cowardly, they're rude, but worst of all, they're lazy.
I mean, literally, the Senate, what is it, like a French work week? You get like 3 days where you have to show up?
Is Jeb Bush right? Do the French work much less than Americans? Well, let's look at the numbers. Your typical American full-time worker works 40 hours a week for about 50 weeks a year. That comes out to a total of 2,000 hours a year. Now, Patrick, what does that number look like in France?
So, French full-time employees work 1,607 hours per year.
That's 400 hours less than the typical American employee. Why is that?
So, there's two reasons. First of all, in France, there's a legally mandated work week of 35 hours.
So more than the 3-day work week that Jeb Bush was talking about, but still 5 hours a week less than your typical 40-hour work week, and much less than the work weeks that a lot of Americans are working, which are more like 50 or 60 hours.
And the other reason is because French employees benefit from 5 weeks of legally mandated paid vacation.
Compare that to an average of 10 days paid time off in the US, not to even mention the nearly a quarter of Americans who get no paid time off whatsoever. Those lazy French.
You see, you say that, but on an hourly basis, France is actually more productive in terms of GDP per capita.
So the important thing to note right off the bat about these French numbers, the 35-hour work week and the 5 weeks of paid vacation a year, is that these are legal requirements. These are legal minimums that all employers must give their employees. So that's quite an unfamiliar concept probably for most Americans, because if you're a salaried employee in the US, the conditions of your job, like how many hours you work a week and how much time you have off, for the most part comes not from law, but from the agreement that is the contract that you have with your employee. In France, job contracts work quite a bit differently.
So in France, as opposed to having random acts passed by Congress or by state legislatures, we have a single unified labor code. They call it the Code de Travail.
We talked about these different codes a bit on episode 2. Each segment of the French law is codified in a code. There's the traffic code, there's the criminal code, and then there's the labor code.
In this labor code, you will find that each stage of being an employee is outlined by law. And as a result, there's a whole line of jurisprudence that allows you to understand essentially how each aspect of the law is applied. As a result, when you get an employment contract, there's only a certain margin of maneuver left to the employer in terms of what they can actually insert in your employment contract.
Yeah, so the contract is almost defined by law, right?
Well, especially when you consider sectorial agreements. Sort of a similar way as in countries like Germany, there can be essentially contractual agreements between the employees of an entire sector and the employers of an entire sector. They basically refine what is already in the labor code, but for the particularities of their specific sector. So as an example, I believe it's hospitality workers have a sectorial agreement, which is meant to account for the fact that they're often called on to work more hours at certain times, or the fact that they need to operate on Sundays, right?
Yeah, so Sundays, for example, the general French labor code prohibits working on Sundays. It's not considered to be a standard work day. However, due to the necessities of many things to still happen on Sunday, there are different sectorial agreements that provide exceptions to that.
Right. And so that just kind of backs up what you were saying as kind of a difference between the US and France, which is that I wouldn't go so far as to say that you will know the contracts in advance, but there's certainly a framework imposed by law and by sectorial agreements that goes well beyond the sort of at will logic that you have in most states in the United States. Employment is definitely not in France, at least in French law, considered as being entirely a free choice on behalf of the employee.
Yeah, so this is again a sort of theme that we'll see coming up again and again, and differences of all sorts between the U.S. and France. You could call it a more statist model. You could say that the French state is more interventionist, or however you want to put it. U.S. labor law is restrictive, right? The state is only there to say you can't do these things, you can't do these things that are going to harm the health of the worker, and so on. Whereas the French labor code is actually defining like minutiae between employers and employees.
My father was a worker, and he loved to work. He'd work on Saturdays, he'd work on Sundays. He just liked it. He'd go to church, but after church, he'd go and work. I watched him be a happy man and work until he was like literally 93. He was 93 years old when he died. And I said to myself, that's a pretty good formula, because I have a lot of friends, they take vacations for 6 weeks and 8 weeks and 3 months, and they're never happy. So I watched my father, so I like to work.
Okay, so in France, there are two types of contracts. There are permanent employment contracts and fixed term employment contracts. Now, what I understand is a difference between the United States and France is that in France, a permanent employment contract is the default. It is the standard, meaning if you are looking to hire someone, you are supposed to default to a permanent employment contract. Why? Because it's more secure for the employee, but it's also more secure for the employer, since you know that if you hire this person, uh, generally speaking, they're going to stick with you. Now, the difference here is that, in my understanding, is in the US, even though permanent contracts are often favored by employers and certainly by employees, they are not legally mandated, meaning you could set a fixed term for your employee if you wanted to. Now, in France, fixed term contracts are only reserved for particular circumstances, like a temporary absence that you need to fill. Now, what is really different between the US and France on this question is the legal maximum hours of work. This is essentially by law the 35-hour work week, which says or which stipulates that employees are not meant to work beyond that. Now, that's different than the US because in the United States, one, there is no maximum fixed by law number of hours that employees can work, but also there is no maximum on salaried employees in the US because their performance is taken into account as to their ability to complete tasks and not on the amount of time they actually spend working. Of course, what we know from practice is that this often just means that employees, especially of high paying white collar jobs, find themselves working 60, 70, 80 hours a week. And too bad for them.
Yeah, that sucks. Move to France.
Yeah. And what's interesting is in France, a lot of people do work above 35 hours. And there's two ways this happens. One, which is what I would call like sort of gray work. I don't know if that's the proper term, but I'm going to use it
Yeah.
anyway. And that's where you check Slack at 9 o'clock after your work day. You upload a file, you send an email,
Yeah.
and it's all kind of done on the margins. And obviously, that's not being counted.
Yeah, and you can't be required to do that. You know, that legally they shouldn't be requiring you to do that, but it's obviously very
Right,
hard.
but we all know how it works in practice, right?
It's obviously very hard to seek recourse against your employer for that, and it's also pretty easy for you to end up feeling pressured that you have to do that, even if your employer didn't say you have to do that. You know, that that's definitely quite common, or that there's obligations outside of work that aren't technically work that they really shouldn't be making you do, but they get away with it. The good news is that kind of thing mostly applies to people in white collar jobs, right? Because it's worth remembering this 35-hour thing is also applying to people, again, working at McDonald's or something like that. And that is also preventing you from working legally multiple jobs, which is quite common in the US, that you could be working 30 hours at McDonald's and 30 hours at a supermarket or something like that. In France, you can't do that.
You're not supposed to do that.
You're not to say no one is, but someone's breaking the law if that's happening. So the 35-hour work week is the first component of the working less thing, and the second one is vacations, our main topic for today. So as I said before, the average American worker gets only 10 days of paid time off a year, not including holidays, and nearly a quarter get none at all. How many did they get in France, Patrick?
So the labor code actually stipulates that every employee, regardless of the type of contract that they're under, and regardless of whether or not they work full, part time, is entitled to 2.5 vacation days per month. Now, we need to clarify a little bit there because what does that actually mean? The quick among you have already realized that that should mean that French employees have 30 days of vacation a year. But it's a bit more complicated than that. And to be really to the point on this, the way I would describe it is the work week in France is calculated on the basis of 6 working days. The reality, of course, is that most people work 5 days a week. So, for most people, this translates to 24 days of vacation per year.
So 5 weeks off a year. That's pretty good. A lot better than 10 days.
But it gets better because most people don't actually work 35 hours a week. They often work more. So the maximum work week of 35 hours applies as an average on the year. So should you work over that average of 35 hours a week, say by working 37 hours a week, you actually are able to take those additional hours and put them towards additional absences from your work.
These extra days off are called RTT days. RTT stands for Réduction du temps de travail, reduction of working time, which is a program implemented in the year 2000 when France moved from a 39-hour work week to a 40-hour work week under the Socialist Communist Coalition government of Prime Minister Lionel Jospin. The idea was to reduce total working hours while still allowing employees to work the same amount of hours as before in a given week in order to minimize disruption to business.
Now, the reason I say additional absences and not vacation days is because, one, vacation days are paid, whereas RTT is just taking time off for work you actually already did. Also, because you can lose RTT for certain absences, like being sick, for example.
I mean, think about that. Still pretty good. If you work 39 hours a week, still an hour less than the standard American full-time week, you're earning a half day of paid leave every single week. Pretty good.
And the important thing to know, I think, from a practical perspective, is a lot of salaried employees will have in their contract it defined that they work 37 and a half hours a week, for example. And thus, they will know in advance that they have a right to a certain number of RTT days.
Which makes sense, of course, because most white-collar jobs don't actually track the number of hours you're working a week.
Right. And that's a bit different from my experience in the public sector, where we actually have like a badge system where you sign in the morning, you sign out for lunch, and then you sign back in the afternoon. And every single hour you work is recorded.
Whether you have RTT hours in your contract or you use a badge system, the total number of hours that you can work a year above the 35-hour work week is fixed at 180. So this means that if you work 180 extra hours a year, you can effectively have a 39-hour average work week. It's just that you will then also be taking 24 RTT days off to make it so that your total number of hours worked is the same as someone who had worked 35 hours a week but hadn't had those extra 24 days off. That is to say, the legal maximum of 1,607 hours a year. Oh, by the way, if you're being pedantic and doing the math and wondering where those extra 7 hours have come from, don't worry about it. It's because of something called the Day of Solidarity, and we're not going to get into it right now. Oh, we should also point out that things aren't exactly the same for public sector employees. The labor code falls under private law, and so public employees fall under public law and therefore under a different system.
Right. I mean, most of the rules that are applicable to them are very similar to that of the private sector. But yeah, indeed, because of the distinction between public and private law that we mentioned in our earlier episodes, public servants are subject to a whole separate regime that we will cover in a future episode.
These paid time off things we're talking about, these are minimums, basically. Certain sectorial conventions give people more time off, right?
So in certain sectorial bargaining agreements, they can essentially establish a regime which is or a scheme that is more favorable to employees if they,
Yeah.
if employees manage to have their voice heard essentially.
But it's not going to be, it's never going to be worse than this. Essentially, this is the or if it is in some way because of the particular natures of the job, like having to work more hours for whatever reason, essential services, then they're going to be compensated in some other way. But this is a baseline. Effectively, this is the norm. And I want to take a moment to just like think about how much better conditions these are than in the US. This is going to be someone who is at the lowest level job you can think of, 18 years old, whatever, first job, is getting conditions that in the US can only be dreamt of by a high level position after decades of working in a job.
And then sometimes not even,
Yes.
right? There are many executives who have 2 or 3 weeks of vacation in their contracts. So they're making a lot of money to send their kid to private school, but they're not making enough money to pick the kid up from
So
school.
I would highly recommend to any Goldman Sachs executives in Manhattan listening to this that they quit their jobs, move to France, and start working at McDonald's, where they will have better conditions, probably less private jet privileges, but frankly, I'd take the vacation over that. So let's go through briefly just some of the other types of benefits that all French workers are getting. Parental leave. Mothers get 16 weeks off for their first two children, 6 weeks before birth and 10 weeks after, and 26 weeks off for further children. That's part of France's famous natalist policies, trying to keep the birth rate up. That's a whole other thing. Public holidays. So, interestingly, in France, actually, the 1st of May, which for those in the US who don't know this, is an important holiday in most countries worldwide, the International Workers' Day. It's actually the only day that is a mandatory holiday for all workers except ones in essential services like hospitals. Which is interesting because that's more like the US, whereas most European countries tend to have it be standard that workers get public holidays off. France, it's only the 1st of May, and the 10 others depend on your sectorial agreements or your company. Then you get 4 days off for getting married, 3 days off for the death of a close family member, and a number of other provisions related to family care for sick relatives or something like that. Which brings us to sick leave. So I think this is of interest to Americans because I know this is frequently a debate in the US is about requiring sick days. But France doesn't have sick days in the same way that many American employees do, and also the way that many other countries require. So in the US, you tend to get a certain number of days off for being sick every year. Days you can only take off if you're sick, theoretically. Whether they ask you to prove that or not depends. And the days are paid days off. And usually it's like, doesn't matter if that's like you've got a cold or you're seriously ill or whatever. It's like that's your fixed number of days. In France, that's not how this works. So in France, the way it works is that you need to get something which is called un arrêt maladie.
A work stoppage order.
Yeah, a work stoppage order. And you do get compensated for that. But interestingly, you don't get compensated in the way you get compensated for time off, which is that your employer continues to pay you. Instead, the way it works is that the social security system pays you in function of your salary, but it's capped at about 52 euros a day. However, if you've been in your job for at least a year, your employer is required to compensate most of the difference between that and your salary.
So the system has the advantage of recognizing people who are actually sick and giving them the time off that they need for it. However, if you go into the doctor's office with a flu, they might just be like, all right, 3 days, right?
That's more than a lot of people in the US are getting.
Sure. But a lot of people might think, well, that's good. But the problem is most flus take a few more days than 3 to clear. And doctors might reason, well, they can just come back to the doctor and get another note. But obviously, if you actually have the flu, it might not be very pleasant to go to the doctor every 3 days to get a renewal. It's a very medicalized system.
It is a very medicalized system because if you have a good sick leave package in the US, you can just stay home for a cold and you don't have to go to a doctor for that, which can be a good thing because, frankly, if I'm working in office, I'd rather if someone has a cold, they stay home for the first couple days and not that they come in because, it's likely that if you wake up in France and you're kind of sick, but you're not like so sick you have to stay in bed, you're not going to be like, I'm going to go to the doctor and you're probably just going to go to the office and.
Right, because not only do you have to go to the doctor, but you then need to transmit the arrêt maladie. Now, this is often done digitally, but nonetheless, to your employer and to the national insurance system.
Yeah. Nevertheless, we have to remember that there's loads of people in the US who just don't have any time
Right,
off.
who
for
just
sick
show
time.
up with COVID-19 because they work in a meat
Yeah,
factory.
and that if you get seriously ill, you're just not getting paid, right? Like most restaurant
Right.
workers, if you have a heart attack, you have to be in the hospital. Sorry, you're just not getting paid because you're not working. And in France, that wouldn't happen. Then your Social Security will take care of you.
One of the issues, though, with the medicalization aspect here, which again, this is not comparative. This is more
Sure.
trying to show the point that France, in these respects, is something that the U.S. could only dream of. But to anybody listening, thinking politically, you might want to still think beyond what France currently has
Oh, definitely.
as your basis, because the medicalization of this makes it, imagine women who have particularly difficult menstruation cycles find themselves going to the doctor on essentially a monthly basis in order to convince likely a man that they need an arrêt maladie for 3 days or more.
Yeah.
Where Spain has taken the steps to introduce specifically days for this purpose into law.
Yeah. I would say the French system works a lot better for serious illnesses than for minor things.
So one of the interesting things is when you have a dispute with your employer, but especially, and we're going to do a whole nother episode on this, I assume, but especially when you find yourself being laid off or being fired, you actually go to a special court. So you go before what is called the Conseil de Prud'homme, which is essentially a unique jurisdiction because the judges are not professional magistrates. Instead, they are an equal number of representatives of employees and an equal part representatives of employers.
Conseil de Prud'homme, by the way, is difficult to translate because prud'homme is a word that's only used in that context, as far as I know. It's sort of like, I think it's like an old French thing, and the origin means wise men. So the Wise Men's Council.
I've personally never been to a trial in front of the Conseil de Prud'homme, but I understand that it can seem quite illegal. Is that a word? Can you say illegal?
Illegal? Sure, why not? I'll let
Like
you say
not
that.
legal?
I'll let you say that.
I understand that it's very non-legal, right? And they're really focused on the facts of the case in a way that a professional judge perhaps wouldn't be. As a result, what comes out of the Conseil de Prud'homme is often reworked on appeal.
So let's move a bit away from the legal aspect here to talk about how these laws play out in practice, the culture of the French summer vacations. So, historically at least, and still to a large extent, people overwhelmingly take these vacations in the summer, August or July. Why? Well, partially because the law does incentivize you or require you to take part of your vacation, what they call the principal vacation, during the summer. At least people who are on like a standard contract. I know that it works differently in some industries. And the second reason being obviously school vacations. Makes sense. Your kid's on vacation in July or August. Makes sense to the big family vacation in July or August. So you frequently get people taking 3 or 4 of their 5 weeks, or 5 weeks plus, if you include RTT, in the summer. Usually in either July or August. You also traditionally have the summer closures, where most big businesses would close their offices completely during August. This happens a lot less today, but it used to be the case, and still is in some places, that you would be forced to take your vacations in August because your business would say, we're closing for 3 weeks, and they can then force you to take your vacations then. This still happens a lot, like a lot of shops or restaurants tend to be closed. If you're ever visiting Paris, for example, in August, it's interesting to see an example of this, which is go outside of the tourist areas. The tourist areas, of course, completely packed in August. But if you go into some more residential neighborhoods where the tourists don't venture, to more of the ordinary parts of Paris, especially the wealthier ones, you will see it just completely empty. Lots of shops and restaurants closed, lots of just things boarded up, lots of people just not there. And that's because just such large numbers of people take their vacations in August. Where do these people go on the vacations? Well, surveys show that people mainly go to the countryside, especially the coast. The Mediterranean coast is the most popular. Of course, the Côte d'Azur in the southeast, which I'm sure most people have heard of, is famous as the ritzy destination for the French upper class, Saint-Tropez, Cannes, places like that. And then the southwest, near Bordeaux, the beaches along there, or the beaches of Brittany are also very famous destinations. It's difficult to emphasize, and this isn't just France, this is all of Europe, basically. The tradition of just like things shutting down in August and people getting out of the city if they can. Of course, that's a key point if they can. Surveys show that upwards of a third of French people don't take a vacation in the summer, and the number one reason for that is financial. They have the time off, but if you can't afford to travel to the beach, can't afford to stay at the beach, you're likely to stay at home. But most people who can get out of the big city get out of the big city and go to the countryside.
You know, when a lot of Americans come to France and are either mesmerized or mildly upset at this idea that people take the month of August off, I think a lot of them kind of reduce it to something cultural or social, right? Like, well, you know, they all take August off because everyone takes August off. But I think the point that we're trying to make here is that these are the result of obviously political movements, but the reason they stay around is because they're codification in the law.
The culture this formed as a result of the law and of this political will. And it didn't exist until less than a century ago.
And just like the United States, it would not exist should the law change.
That's true. Yeah, because of course, if people couldn't take vacation, there wouldn't be a culture of taking vacations. So you may be wondering how this came about in France. So before 1936, France was much like the US. Some people had time off, some people didn't. But it was really in 1936 that this changed. In 1936, the Popular Front came into power in France. This is, you may remember from our election episodes, we've talked about the current new Popular Front, the left-wing coalition that came first in the recent elections. They're named after the original Popular Front, which won a majority in Parliament in 1936 and was composed of the SFIO, which is the French section of the Workers' International, which was the predecessor of the current Socialist Party, and the Radical Party, which was a big liberal party that fell off soon after that. And then they had the support of the Communist Party. And there was a famous name. I don't know if people in the US have heard of this name, but very famous man in France, Léon Blum, who was a socialist who became prime minister of France in 1936 on the back of many promises to improve workers' rights. But interestingly, there was no promise about vacations. And in fact, the French left, and especially the communists, were kind of opposed to the idea of paid time off. So was the CGT, which is the General Confederation of Labor. It's one of the biggest trade unions in France, and it was historically tied to the Communist Party. And France was actually one of the last European countries to institute paid time off. Germany had already done it in 1905, Austria, Hungary, and the Scandinavian countries in 1910. And France was predated by Czechoslovakia, Poland, Luxembourg, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece, Romania, and even many Latin American countries like Chile, Mexico, and Brazil. In France, it was often seen as a German thing by the French left, which calling something a German thing in France is not a good thing. But the Popular Front's win in the 1936 elections set off a massive wave of strikes, which the French philosopher Simone Weil called strikes of joy. These strikes led to the Matignon Accords. The Matignon is the name of the residence of the French prime minister, between the CGT union, the major employers, and the state, which led to massive pay rises across all industries. And soon after, Parliament introduced bills reducing the working week from 48 hours to 40 hours and introducing, for the first time, 2 weeks of paid leave to all French workers. Still, the strikes went on for months. Here's an interesting description from the historian Antoine de Bayek describing the origin of paid leave in a 2006 article in the newspaper Liberation. This unrest was nothing new. Social conflicts have been multiplying for the past 20 years. What was new about these strikes, and from this came the force of the movement, was the ambiance. The workers, carried along by the political victory of the left, seemed certain to win. In the occupied factories, a tranquil joy reigned, a way of life as well, with food, dances, music, chants, lively meetings, group photos, solidarity between ages and professions, all of it spread across the country by media reports. A strange moment of collective joy, an effervescent parenthesis, like a breath of fresh air. Hence the difficulty of returning to work, even once the strike's principal demands were met. It was in this atmosphere of rediscovered worker pride that the idea of paid vacations came about, more of a demand for general well-being and working-class cultural identity than a clearly defined material demand. Paid vacations are in the end the summer extension of a social movement that was lived spontaneously as an affirmation itself of the French homo ouvriers. Léon Blum, at the end of 1936, described how these changes, the lowering of the working week, the introduction of paid holidays, and the pay rises had changed France. He said, "France now has another look and another air. The blood flows quicker in a rejuvenated body. Everything makes you feel that in France, the human condition has been elevated." I find it kind of sad to read those quotes now. Don't you think, Patrick? Because
I know.
It was really a time where people thought anything was possible. And that's definitely not the feeling you get in France let alone the US these days.
Yeah, but also Lamb Bloom is saying this just a couple years before Vichy.
That is true.
And
It's
so the blood he's talking about there, I'm not sure it's that of excited workers, but maybe that of a aggressively fascist middle class.
I don't want to blame Leon Bloom for that. Try to leave our listeners with a sense of hope there, but I did say 1936, so that kind of undercuts it. Suffice to say that this popular front did not last too long, was undermined by liberals. Shocking. And a few years later, there was a collaborationist fascist regime and a Nazi occupation in France. But paid time off stuck around, as did the 40-hour work week. So, uh, let's say a mixed legacy from Mr. Bloom there.
So this culture that was born out of legally mandated vacations has led to an entire infrastructure being built around taking advantage of those 5 weeks.
Yeah, and I think more than just an infrastructure, there was an ideal, at least initially, that this wasn't just about paid time off. This was about proper vacations and trying to get the French working class vacations.
Right. And arguably, it was part of an early form of socializing medicine in France. Breaks were considered necessary and still should be considered necessary in order to have a healthy worker
Yeah.
who is able to manage their obligations to their
Yes.
family,
Yeah.
to their labor, and to to their longevity.
Not to mention that the air in working class suburbs of Paris was not the cleanest at the time. That there was a desire to get people to the countryside, which can sometimes be a conservative impulse too. It could have, but in this case, I think it's a good thing.
No doubt. In any of this, you're going to find
There's a paternalist Tory thing.
But there always is going to be, because the non-paternalist way of dealing with this is a much more radical political project that I don't think there was
Yeah,
a coalition for at this time.
that's true. That's true.
Right? Because what does fair labor conditions look like under a worker-led government? It certainly doesn't look like 5 weeks of vacation a year, right? It looks like an entire reorganization of labor.
Absolutely.
So these things need to be understood as compromises, and the compromise is always going to have a paternalist aspect to it, because you need to convince a socially conservative part of society. And that's why, and we'll get into this in other episodes, especially as it involves unions, that's why under Vichy France's fascist collaborationist regime, you will find odd pro-worker things in certain areas, or at least seemingly so, because they have a paternalist social ideal built into fascism, right? So yeah, so these things are compromises, and there's no way of getting around that. And any critique of it is warranted as a result.
The critique of it is warranted, but also it's hard to not feel that the Communist Party's opposition to paid time off was misguided. So the first one of these things that was introduced to try to promote a culture of vacations in France and the ability for the average French worker to take a vacation was what was called the Lagrange ticket, after Leo Lagrange, who was the Minister of Sport, Leisure and Physical Education in Bloom's government. And this still exists. And it's a ticket from the French National Train Company, SNCF, that everyone is entitled to buy once a year at a 25% off for taking their annual vacation. It was originally 40% off, but still exists. Still kind of an interesting relic of that, and still, benefits people. Although most workers probably don't take the train on a holiday anymore because it's expensive, sadly. Then we got later developments, one of the most interesting of which I think is the vacation colonies. These were sort of like summer camps for children that were started by a lot of the working class municipalities in the areas around Paris, especially the ones run by the Communist Party. And they frequently bought buildings, interestingly enough, often old like chateaus in the French countryside, and ran them as subsidized retreats for working class children. So this boomed so much in the decades after the introduction of, especially after the Second World War, but it started in the 30s, that by 1954, the suburbs of Paris had a total of 586 municipally owned vacation colonies, which were frequented by more than 60,000 children a year.
Yeah, now these still exist and are quite common.
Yeah, a lot of them have been sold off, though.
Yeah.
And a lot of them aren't in great condition anymore.
No, I can attest to that.
But I still find that a fascinating thing. I mean, I remember when I first heard about that, I was like, That is so strange to think that your suburb in Paris could own a beach house just in, on the other side of France. That's a really cool legacy.
Absolutely.
Then you have municipal campgrounds, which is also kind of linked to this. These are very common in France. They tend to be very cheap, and they tend to be very nice, actually. I remember the first time I stayed in a French publicly owned campground, my mind was blown because I'm used to New England campgrounds, which means, if you're lucky, there's a porta potty. Not a porta potty. If you're lucky, there's like
An outhouse.
outhouse. That's the word I'm looking for. A goddamn falling apart wooden structure where you can take a crap on a pile. But when I first went to one in France, I was like, oh my God, it's cheap. They've got a swimming pool often. They've got a pétanque court, which is a very popular game in the south of France. It's like bocce. I think that's more common in America. And they've got like real bathrooms with showers. And that is, interestingly enough, also sort of an origin of this was, well, it was a bit of revenue for these southern and coastal municipalities, but it was also promoted nationally as a way to make it affordable for working class people from the cities to go on vacation.
And I feel like the explanation for why we don't have as much of this in the US is either this idea that the moment you're in the wilderness, you should be really in the wilderness, right? And that we can't build any facilities out there because that would destroy the wilderness. I think the real reason is we don't want government to do this kind of stuff.
There are public campgrounds that are like owned by national parks in the US. But what you see a lot in France that I feel like you don't really see in the US is like, these campgrounds in France aren't just in the middle of nowhere. They're also just in like towns and stuff. And in like, beach towns and things like that, which I'm sure that exists in the US, but it's definitely less common than in France.
I think most towns where you would be able to do that kind of thing in the US probably have prohibitions on temporary structures, which are often used at campgrounds.
Oh yeah, and the last thing they want is people who can't afford a hotel being in your fancy Cape Cod community, right? And if they did ever have something like that, they sold it off decades ago to someone to build condos.
Condos that are built to a quality similar to that of a tent in a French campground.
Yeah. Then there's vacation checks. This is a program I thought this was interesting. It was introduced by the Ministry of Free Time, which was a ministry that very briefly existed under the first Mitterrand government in the 80s. I kind of like that name. That's fun. And it's a program. It's not obligatory, but a lot of places, especially bigger companies, do it where they can sell vacation checks to their employees at a steep discount where the employee only pays a fraction of the cost. The companies are incentivized to do this with tax incentives. Basically, that's like a benefit that's not taxable, and these can then be used to buy train tickets, buy hotel tickets and stuff. And then again, another way of the state trying to promote people going on vacations they wouldn't be able to otherwise afford. But then we get to the people who can't go on vacation. And that's definitely something that's become more common, I think, is probably as these old social programs like the vacation colonies have been degraded, and France has definitely moved away from that sort of mentality of the state doing everything like that it had in the middle of the 20th century.
A lot of this has to do with the cost of going on vacation that's typical of any country, but also the train system in France, while performant, while fast, while good, cheaper service has been largely phased out. So even though there's high-speed trains that can connect you with nearly any city in France, or nearly any of the bigger cities in France, they are often the only option. Like more traditional rail is not available, so you can pay a lot for your ticket. And then highways, so getting around in a car is much more expensive than in the United States. A liter of gasoline is almost double. Tolls are quite expensive. So actually getting around France, while France has better trains, better roads than the United States, it's often more expensive. And a lot of workers don't have a car because they don't need one.
Yep. There's been actually a very interesting initiative since 2002 in Paris called Paris Plage, or Paris Beach, which gets I feel like people snicker at it a lot in France, and also American tourists sometimes find it kind of bewildering when they go, that this program every summer puts like sand along the banks of the Seine, sort of fake beaches. They don't actually touch the water because the banks of the Seine, or the part of the banks that it's on, is actually way above the water level of the Seine, at least in the dry times in summer. And it does look a little bit silly. They bring out palm trees sometimes and deck chairs and things like this. But I actually think it's a really cool initiative because the whole idea behind it, as stated by Bertrand Delanoë, the mayor at the time, is to benefit people who can't afford to get out of Paris in the summer. And it's expanded since. There's now areas you can swim in the La Villette Bassin. Don't know how to translate that. I don't know. What do you think of Paris Plage, Patrick?
Yeah, so obviously I think it's a half measure, right? I would rather that the government focus on increasing wages, increasing access to train.
Yeah, for sure. No, for sure. But as something for the mayor of Paris to do, I think it's a nice initiative. I think the number one thing that they could do, well, aside from, okay, yes, increasing wages would be the best. But in terms of like a public policy that wasn't related to labor, it would be about trains. Hopefully we'll do an episode on that at some point. The train system in France. It's great on the one hand, but on the other hand, just like Patrick said, it's become expensive, and the conventional service that maybe would take 3 or 4 times as long to get to the south of France, but was also affordable, has been really left by the wayside.
One aspect of Paris Beach that I do like, though, is the emphasis on making where you are currently livable given the time of year, especially in terms of climate adaptation, right? I feel like climate adaptation policy is always talking about the very important physical infrastructure that you need to prevent your city from going underwater, from buildings not collapsing under different climatic situations. But there's also the really important aspect, which is making sure that in a city that gets as hot as Paris, there's a way to deal with it that is not just pumping air conditioning into closed spaces.
Yeah, and it also is not just get out of Paris, which is the very
Right.
much the Parisian middle class and upper classes response to it being unlivably hot in the summer. It's just like, well, I don't care. I'm not there in the summer. So yeah, well, lots of people are.
And it doesn't have to be like that, right? There are plenty of like adaptation methods that again are not those traditional ones that you can take in order to make a city more livable when it gets really hot. I mean, just plant some trees for instance. Uh, Paris Plage is a great example of how you can turn something that's normally not a benefit into a benefit for your citizens. Outdoor activity. There's all types of things that you can do, and I think it's a good example of that.
Yeah.
However, one of the things I do find funny about Paris Beach is not making fun of people who use it, but the fact that the government has to buy many tons of sand, and they have to buy it from a company who's going to bring it there and then take it away at the end of it. And it's not just any sand, right? You can't take the same sand you use for parking lots.
Yeah, that sand sucks. You don't want to sit in that. It's nice beach
Exactly.
sand. I don't know where they get it from, but
So every year there is a public contract that they have to do it's a competitive bid that they put out, and typically there's only one company that even offers the service, because I assume there's only one company willing to find that much sand and bring it to central Paris, right? Imagine all these trucks coming in and whatnot, and the labor they need to
I think
find
they do it in
to
a
unload
barge.
them and
Actually, I'm
everything.
not sure, but I think they do it in a barge, which is
Yeah, it's
fun.
true. I don't. It might be a barge. It might be a barge. In any case, it's kind of funny. It's at least last time I checked, it was only one company submitted an offer.
It's probably not the best way to go about doing something like this. It is like it's also so temporary, and yet they do it. Have been doing it every year for over 2 decades.
And it's not just Paris Plage. There's also several in the 93, for example.
Are they really? I didn't know that. That's cool. Okay, so we're coming both to the end of the episode and the end of the summer, and let's finish out by presenting the concept of what happens at the end of the summer. La rentrée. I think this is a fun concept that indicates how much this sort of annual vacation structures French society. If you're in France at the beginning of September, at the end of August, you will constantly hear about la rentrée. And la rentrée means the return, and in some contexts, it could be translated as back to school, because it's la rentrée académique, is the return to classes, rentrée scolaire, return to schooling, the beginning of the school year. But what I think is fascinating is that it's also just used in the context of returning to work, sort of returning to society, returning to Paris if you left Paris for August, or sorry, not to be too Paris centric here, returning to whatever city you live in. And a lot of things like start their new year at the beginning of September. It's a lot of cultural activities, a lot of things like this, and they use the term la rentrée for all of them.
Right. And remember, when you come back from work, remember that even if you didn't take August off, most of your colleagues probably did.
Yeah.
And so there are sometimes like 2 people in an office that normally has 20 who are just kind of taking advantage of the fact that no one's there.
And often employers don't want you to stay in the office for all of August because it's pretty great if you can do that because not that much is going on. You can sort of get like a month of semi-vacation and then take your actual vacation at one of the busy times of year.
But most people don't do that for one obvious reason, which is everyone else is on vacation. Most people want to take their vacation in August because it's when everyone else is. Like they have family friends who are going to the same village as them. They have their kids want to go on vacation with another family's kids. Like there's like every time I've been working in France or talked to people about working in France, there's like 2 people who actually want to stay for August. It's never a problem.
But if it does work out for you, if you're not tied down to a family and stuff, it is pretty good because you can stay in the office for August and then travel at a much less expensive time of year. Because also, August is when everyone's traveling, not just in France, but in all of Europe. So, welcome to La Rentrée of the Royal Palace Podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
La France est une chose, à mes yeux, très considérable. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Je veux dire par là qu'à mon sens, elle est quelque chose de très grand. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il y a même là quelque chose d'extraordinaire. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il faut que la France joue son rôle, c'est exact. Et pour qu'elle joue son rôle, il faut qu'elle soit la France.